Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another edition of Mr. Merrigan's Moments in History, U.S. History Edition. So we've kind of had a little bit of a theme with our last few videos on the channel, but the idea is to create some supports for students when it comes to analyzing primary sources. And in today's video, I'm going to help kind of guide them through some of these core ideas from the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. And kind of at the center of what we're going to be looking at today with three different documents is, why did many white Americans support the Chinese Exclusion Act? And certainly in this first document, we're going to be looking at a great political cartoon, great in the sense of what it tells us, not necessarily the subject. As far as the beliefs, it's a really great visual for the time period. And helping to understand this. The second one's going to come from probably somebody more fearful of the Chinese, particularly the economic threat that they feel towards them, especially when it comes to work. And then the third one's going to come from a Chinese immigrant who's going to highlight his experience. And again, all three of these, they all bring a very interesting perspective that I want to kind of hone in with my students. So I always tell students, start with your sourcing. Before I get to that though, real quick, shout out to the SHEG group. Now they're called DIG, or the Digital Inquiry Group. But if any teachers happen to stumble upon this video, highly recommend them. They're a fantastic resource. But we're going to be looking at this political cartoon to start out with, and I've kind of zoomed in here a little bit easier just so you can kind of see some of the details. But again, we're centering around this question: why would so many Americans, particularly white Americans, why did they support the passing of the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882? So this one was created in 1871 prior to the passage, but it kind of gives you a sense. And they've done a really nice job too here of helping us source. So the cartoon again comes to us from the great Thomas Nast, who's given us so many different political cartoons to help illustrate so many parts of American history. But it's written for Harper's Weekly, which is a magazine in the North. It's important to keep that in mind too. But you're going to see a feminine symbol that's supposed to represent the United States, and her name is Columbia. You can see there's certainly some resemblance between her and Lady Liberty. And again, I think that was intentional. The idea of sort of that symbol of opportunity, and like we talked about, like with the quote on the Statue of Liberty, and again, welcoming all, and especially those who maybe other countries would toss aside. And I think you're going to see that here as an example with the Chinese. You are going to see her protecting a Chinese man, and that word's important, protecting. Particularly in this case, specifically against a gang of Irish and German, they're going to use the word thugs, but certainly a group who's set on maintaining their position. Remember, these are both groups who met a lot of prejudice and discrimination when they first came to the United States, and have sort of found their way into American society through assimilation, regaining some power. And maybe they see the Chinese as a threat. So that's an important detail, certainly, to indicate here. And I know it's difficult to read, but here on the bottom, and thankfully they give it to us here, it says, "Hands off, gentlemen. America means fair play for all men." So some very kind of intricate, specific details given to us. And as you look through this, certainly you can see the signs, you can see weapons. So this intention of violence if needed, but you can also see on this wall behind our Chinese immigrant, there's some words that jump out right away. And you see them, like barbarian is up here many times. Again, this idea of the Chinese being uncivilized and being like a physical threat. Remember, one of the things we talked about with immigrants coming to the United States, especially when we look at nativism, is this idea of blaming them for crime. You're seeing words like lowest and vilest. You're seeing words like vicious. So like violent and angry, immoral, right, against the principles. Heathenism, bringing that different faith, being a threat to maybe the Christian way of life that has very much developed in the United States at this point. You've seen, like these ideas of taking jobs. You've seen degraded labor, right? Taking away those opportunities. And there's, certainly a variety of different other examples in here, but certainly a lot of these come back to those ideas about why the Chinese were seen as a threat. A lot of them are economic. A lot of them are fear of a different culture, a different religion, a different custom set. And so that fear is a big driver. So when you come back to this question of the why, this one highlights some of those prejudice, and later on with the exclusion itself, discrimination of why you're getting into this fear, why they supported this act. And again, I think you can kind of get a sense too of certainly what the different characters symbolize, and definitely why Nast chose the groups that he did. The Irish, the Germans make sense. They are that first wave of immigrants, right? And this next wave they see maybe as a threat to the gains that they've made, the hurdles they've had to go past in order to get to where they are. So I hope that helps break it down a little bit. Again, for my students, it's a challenge, and I would say this is a difficult one to interpret, and you've really got to look for details. So take that moment, pause back at this video if you need to go back and look at some of these details. Feel free to pause if you need to, kind of look through it, come back to this text, because I'll give you a paper copy of this to look at too, and I'll probably provide it to you digitally so you can zoom in like I have been. All right, want to take a moment here. Document C. This is from Working Men of San Francisco. So again, we're coming back to this same question about why did many white Americans support the passing of the Chinese Exclusion Act. So start with your sourcing. Again, this document's from a speech to the Working Men of San Francisco, and it was provided on the 16th of August in 1888. So it's, again, 6 years after the passing. And certainly if you're looking at San Francisco, this is where Angel Island was, right off the coast of San Francisco. This is, again, California is where the most Chinese immigrants were coming into the United States. And so it makes sense to sort of focus in on this group, because there's not going to be maybe necessarily the same fear in New York. You might see that be other groups of immigrants coming to the United States from Southern and Eastern Europe. We have met here in San Francisco tonight to raise our voice to you in warning of a great danger. So already painting with fear, right? We can already hear that here. That seems to us imminent. Imminent's one of our vocab words that they've highlighted. That means about to happen. So again, playing off people's fears. This danger is coming. It's almost seems like it's about to happen. And threatens our almost utter destruction as a prosperous community. Prosperous in this case, meaning like thriving or doing well. So you're already, even in that first sentence, you're already hearing the fear mongering. You're already hearing the painting of an imminent threat, right? It's coming. It's inevitable, maybe. And the idea that you play off that fear is going to be important here. The speech continues. The danger is that while we have been sleeping in fancied security, so we've been lulled into thinking we're okay, that we're safe, believing that the tide of Chinese immigration to our state had been checked. So again, remember, this has been written after the Chinese Exclusion Act, so they think, okay, we're safe, the ban's on. And was in a fair way to be entirely stopped, because remember, no Chinese people were allowed to come in. Our opponents, the pro-China wealthy men of the land, have been wide awake and have succeeded in retrieving the importation of these Chinese slave labor. Remember, one of the fears is driving down wages. And what you're doing in a time period where workers are already overworked, they're already stressed, they're working long hours, they're trying to improve their safety, they're trying to form unions. They're afraid of this coming to threaten their opportunity. Okay, he continues. So that now hundreds and thousands of Chinese are every week flocking into our state. In this case, the state means the country. Notice that it's capitalized. Today, every avenue of labor of every sort is crowded with Chinese slave labor. Again, he's choosing specific words in his speech with the idea they're going to take less pay, or maybe they're not going to get paid at all. And how can you as a worker compete with that? How can you feed your family? Again, feeling that fear. Worse than it was 8 years ago. The boot, shoe, and cigar industries are almost entirely in their hands. In the manufacture of men's overalls and women's and children's underwear, they run over 3,000 sewing machines night and day. So again, playing on that fear, they're slowly, day and night, chipping away at economic opportunity. They monopolize, important word to mention here too, given some of the fears that some people feel towards, say, even people like Rockefeller, who did create a monopoly. They monopolize in nearly all the farming done to supply the market with all sorts of vegetables. This state of things, the way things are, brings about a terrible competition between our own people. Notice he chose the words own people. He's talking about people born in the United States, pitting us against them, who must live as civilized Americans. Again, painting this picture that the Chinese were uncivilized. And the Chinese who have lived like degraded slaves. He's going back to that imagery time and time again, that fear. We should all understand that this state of things cannot be much longer endured. Again, painting this picture of fear. All right, the last one is a great perspective, and I'm glad that we have it in this because I think it's necessary to see the perspective from the Chinese. So we're going to get a piece from an autobiography of a Chinese immigrant. Now, you are going to hear the term Chinaman in here a lot, and at the time, that would have been very common. Today, especially if I'm talking to my students here, is not really an appropriate term, but understand that it's the way people talked in this time period. So it's not the way you and I would talk today. We would have a better term like Chinese American, but you're going to hear that term a lot in this particular document, even in the title. So this is a passage from Li Chu, who's our author. He wrote the biography of a Chinaman. Again, a little bit of an outdated term now. It was independently published, and it was published on February 19th of 1903. So again, a little time afterwards, and it gives us the page numbers that the text has been pulled from, 417 through 423, in different segments. All right. The treatment of the Chinese in this country is all wrong and mean. Get straight to the point right away. There is no reason for the prejudice. Again, we talked about prejudice as the ideas against the Chinese. The cheap labor cry has always been a falsehood. Their labor was never cheap and is not cheap now. It has always commanded the highest market price. So again, trying to combat that idea, especially that imagery from the last speech with the terms like slave. But the trouble is that the Chinese are such excellent and faithful workers that bosses will have no others when they can have them. If you look at men working on the street, you'll find a supervisor for every 4 or 5 of them. That watching is not necessary for the Chinese. They work as well when left to themselves as when they do when someone is looking at them. So again, he's trying to sort of paint this idea that maybe there's some jealousy towards the way the Chinese have been viewed by employers. It was jealousy of laboring men of other nationalities, especially the Irish. Remember, these are 2 groups that have a certain amount of competition going for them in this time period. that raised the outcry against the Chinese. No one would hire an Irishman, German, Englishman, or Italian when they could get a Chinese. Because our countrymen are so much more honest, industrious, the idea that they're, more familiar with the manufacturing side of things, steady, sober, and painstaking. A lot of attention to detail in that case. Chinese were persecuted, not for their vices, aka their sins, but for their virtues, their good qualities. Again, he's coming back to this idea of maybe there's some jealousy, maybe there's some resentment that employers have chosen the Chinese above others for maybe some of these reasons. There are few Chinamen in jails and none in the poorhouses. Again, trying to combat that idea that the Chinese and other immigrant groups are responsible for the crime rates or for unemployment that we talked about in class. There are no Chinese tramps or drunkards. Probably making a generalization here, but he's trying to prove a point. Many Chinese here have become sincere Christians in spite of the persecution which they have had to endure from their heathen countrymen. Again, he's maybe trying to, use a term here that would refer to anybody maybe who had a non-Christian belief. But interesting that he chose that word to talk about his fellow countrymen. More than half the Chinese in this country would become citizens if allowed to do so, and would be patriotic Americans. They'd love their country. But how can they make this country their home as matters now are? So in other words, how could you feel welcome if this is the current situation in the United States? They are not allowed to bring their wives here from China, and if they marry American women, there's a great outcry. He's kind of feeling like, hey, we can't win. Under the circumstances, how can I tell this is my home? And how can anyone blame me if I take my money and go back to my village in China? So certainly, again, painting with some broad strokes, but certainly he's trying to combat some of these other fear tactics that were used in Document C. So as you come back to these questions, kind of be thinking about what other groups have faced that sort of persecution, like the Irish, for example. What similarities do you see? What differences do you see? Maybe even think the Japanese in World War II, or if you want to go even more modern, the way maybe some, Mexican Americans or Central and South Americans who have made their way to the United States, have they experienced some things that you've seen on the news? And again, at the end, what can we as people learn from the Chinese Exclusion Act? What lessons can we take from the past? And what can we use these ideas and build the connections to what maybe we sometimes see today to learn from it, right? Because that is one of the reasons why I think studying history is so important, is what lessons can we take from the past to help us move forward, to make better decisions in the future, and to provide a better opportunity for everyone in this country. I hope you found it helpful. Those of you who are just listening, I really appreciate it. I hope that maybe it sparks some interest, or maybe makes you want to dive a little bit deeper into these ideas. But I think studying immigration in U.S. history is very fascinating. So thank you so much for listening, and we'll see you next time on Mr. Merrigan's Moments in History.